Hi friends! For today, we are going to be looking into a true crime case that is honestly full of twists and turns and a type of magic that I did not know of. That is honestly so interesting that this type of spirituality is in existence. And today we are going to be talking about Hex Hollow, or as it's known these days, Spring Valley County Park. And it's an area in central Pennsylvania in York County near the border of Maryland. And it played host to a murder that received national attention back in 1928. John Blymire was born in York County, Pennsylvania in 1895, and this county was said to have been home to a number of superstitions and folklore amongst the Pennsylvania Dutch people who lived there, as the majority of his neighbors were early German settlers who brought over with them their own culture when they moved to America. This part of Pennsylvania was known as the Hex Belt, where a belief in witches and magic was prominent. And while many of the settlers were farmers, there were quite a few people who engaged in witchcraft for hire, who were known as powwowers, which I'm fairly certain is a word they stole from the Native Americans, and it appears that this form of magic mixes paganism with Christianity. And these people were said to cure illnesses by herbs, magical powders, potions, charms. They would hex people and remove hexes from people, and would even be able to locate lost objects, as well as people and animals, and be able to tell the future. And oftentimes residents would opt for seeking out the wisdom of the local witch, as opposed to seeing a medical doctor for ailments like the flu and colds, but sometimes also for legitimate illnesses as well. That was how much faith they had in this power of witchcraft. Now, each person who practiced this form of witchcraft, who were called powwowers, they would consult a spell book by John George Homan called Long Lost Friend, which contained the instructions and ingredients needed to cast and remove all sorts of charms, hexes, potions, etc. John Blymire was actually a hereditary witch, meaning that he was born into a family of already established witches. And what's interesting here is that men were primarily involved in witchcraft, which you often don't hear of. A lot of the time it's the women in town who are the healers and things like that, which was why so many women were suspected and executed of witchcraft back in the day. But John's father and grandfather were both powwowers as well, and John was said to have inherited this supernatural ability, or so they described. John would spend his years growing up around his dad and grandfather, learning about their craft and harnessing that knowledge for himself. But there were other witches in the area, of course, that people would go to, and that John's family would go to as well if they weren't able to heal something on their own, which happened when John had developed opnema at the age of 5, which was described as a person wasting away, which these people believed was due to a hex having been put on them, though in a more rational sense, it was likely more due to malnutrition. And so this particular witch lived 8 miles away, and his name was Nelson Rehmeyer, who lived alone and grew potatoes. And he was a bit scary upon first sight. He was tall and brooding from his description, and he could supposedly conjure up Beelzebub, who is supposedly one of the top demons in hell. So when John was sick, his family brought him over to Nelson's house, and so John was escorted into Nelson's dark basement, and apparently they were down there for about half an hour. John's father was instructed by Nelson to make John urinate into a pot before sunrise and then boil an egg in it. Then they were to take a needle and pierce 3 holes into the egg, and then they were supposed to leave that on an anthill, and when the ants consumed that whole product, then John was supposed to be cured. And apparently by the time spring rolled around, John was cured. So then a couple years later, John began testing out his witchcraft powers on those around him. And at the age of 7, John was apparently able to help his grandfather stop having difficulty urinating. I'm not sure how, but apparently that's what he did. And when he was 10, he began working at Nelson's house, where he would dig up potatoes for 25 cents a day. Now, the thing about John was that while he was a very gifted witch, he wasn't that intelligent. And as well, he was said to not be very attractive, he was very fidgety, all of which caused people to generally keep clear of him. Of course, unless they needed to seek out his services, which caused John to become very lonely and isolated. In 1908, when John was 13, he quit school and began working in a cigar factory in York, living in a rooming house. And although he didn't socialize much, word had eventually spread around that John had the ability to heal people, and people began seeking him out. A coworker had what was called a wheal on his eye, which I believe is kind of like having a sort of blister or scab around your eye, but I'm not entirely sure, and John agreed to help him get rid of it. And what this man was instructed to do was to bring a dirty supper plate to work, where John then pressed the dirty side against this man's infected eye while he muttered something that his coworker wasn't able to make out. Suddenly, he threw the plate on the ground and it smashed to pieces. He made a cross with his finger 3 times over his coworker's eye and said it would be healed by the following day. And to his coworker's amazement, it was. But John's health began declining, again from apnea, where he was afflicted with a loss of appetite and an inability to sleep. He was losing more and more weight and was convinced that someone had hexed him, thinking that maybe it was a rival powwower who didn't want John to become too successful with his witchcraft. Now, John wouldn't be able to remove this hex until he knew who it was who'd cast it onto him, and no one was able to figure it out. He talked to multiple witches, but no one could discern who the person was who had hexed him. So then in 1913, John quit his job at the cigar factory because he felt he needed to dedicate more time to figuring out how to break this hex that he felt had been put on him. He spent all of his money seeking out help from other witches, but it was no use, and by the time John was 19 years old, he weighed only 100 pounds and was really not doing well, to say the least. Then one night, as he was trying to sleep, the clock struck midnight, and John heard an owl hoot outside 7 times. And this was when he realized that the person who hexed him was most likely the spirit of his great-grandfather Jacob, who had also been a witch and was the 7th son of a 7th son. So he figured that moving away from the area where his great-grandfather had lived and was buried would help to remove the hex, and apparently it did. But then he met Lily Holloway, who was the daughter of the landlord of the rooming house that he was staying at. They got married in 1917, and love seemed to be the answer to John's problems. He gained weight, his health improved, and his witchcraft services began getting more and more popular. However, tragedy struck with the birth of their first child, who died only 5 weeks after being born. Their second child was born prematurely and died after only 3 days. John began getting headaches again, and he lost his job, so he believed that the hex was back, and he swore not to stop until he found out who was responsible for hexing him and put a stop to it. John then sought the help of a witch named Andrew C. Linhart, who even the police were quite fearful of. Andrew was said to be so powerful that if he hexed you, only the devil would be strong enough to remove it. When consulted by John, Andrew told him that he had been hexed by someone very close to him, and for some reason John began to think that it was his wife. Lily began getting extremely scared for her safety, as one of Andrew's clients had murdered her husband after receiving similar news that he had hexed her, prompting her father to hire a lawyer who was able to get John examined by a psychiatrist who deemed John as being borderline psychoneurotic, and he was subsequently admitted to the Harrisburg Mental Hospital. 48 days later, John escaped and went back to York, where Lily promptly divorced him. So then in 1928, John went back to work at the cigar factory, and this time met a 14-year-old boy named John Curry, who'd went through an abusive childhood and actually thought himself to be hexed as well. So naturally, the two Johns became friends. John then consulted with Nellie Knoll, an old river witch from Marietta, with whom John had had 6 sessions for $5 each, and by the end of it, Nell determined that it was actually Nelson Rehmeyer who had hexed John. John couldn't believe it. Nelson had helped to cure him all those years back and had given him a job. Nell then told John to take out a dollar bill and stare at George Washington's picture, and as John did just that, the face of George Washington morphed into that of Nelson's, which was proof enough for John. She also told him that Nelson was responsible for hexing John Curry, as well as another farmer who had sought John's help for being hexed. So Nell told him that the only way to break Nelson's hex was either to steal his copy of Long Lost Friend, which was that spell book that powwowers used, and burn it, or he had to cut off a lock of Nelson's hair and bury it 6 to 8 feet below the ground. So John Curry, and the son of a farmer who had been said to have been hexed by Nelson as well, named Wilbert, made a plan to travel to Nelson's cabin and take his copy of the Long Lost Friend, or if they weren't able to, cut off a lock of his hair. So on a rainy night in November, the 3 men made their way to Nelson's cabin, and they were petrified Nelson was very powerful, and they weren't sure how the situation was going to play out. But nonetheless, they knocked on his door, and Nelson let them inside. And the three guys ended up being too terrified to bring up anything about Nelson supposedly hexing them. So they just stayed up talking for hours. And when Nelson was tired and was going to go to bed, he invited the three men to stay the night. And in the morning, he fed the three guys breakfast and then they left. But I guess after this, John gained his resolve back, and he and Curry went to the hardware store to purchase some rope where they cut it into 14.5-foot pieces. Then they went back and collected Wilbert, and on the night of the full moon, they made the return to Nelson's cabin. This time, John didn't waste any time in demanding Nelson give him the book. Nelson tried playing dumb, saying that he didn't know what John was talking about, which caused John to fly into a frenzy, shrieking and attacking Nelson, with Curry and Wilbert joining in as well. And since Nelson was such a huge guy, it ended up taking the force of all three of them to hold him down, where Curry ended up tying up Nelson's legs. Nelson told them that he would give them the book if they just let him up. So they did, and Nelson just threw them his wallet, which just pissed John off, and he ended up attacking Nelson once again. When they had him on the floor this time, John tied a piece of rope around Nelson's neck and began to choke him, while Wilbert kicked and beat at him, and Curry took a block of wood and hit Nelson 3 times on the head until his ears started to bleed. And the three of them continued until Nelson's face was basically unrecognizable. John was said to have exclaimed, "Thank God, the witch is dead." And shortly after midnight, the three men searched through the house for money, where they found just under $3. I read in one account that in order to top everything off, the three of them actually burned Nelson's body so that the murder couldn't be traced back to them. Even though Nelson's body was engulfed in flames, he apparently did not burn. 3 days later, Nelson's body was discovered by a neighbor, and it honestly didn't take that much time for the police to figure out who did this to him. And John, Curry, and Wilbert were all arrested, with John even bragging about his involvement in Nelson's death, saying that he had killed the witch who'd hexed him. Obviously, the media ran with this story, talking about voodoo magic and mocking the beliefs that the Pennsylvania Dutch people believed in. But the judge presiding over the case, Ray P. Sherwood, thought that this whole witchcraft thing was a bunch of malarkey and did not understand why the media was so hung up about it, telling the attorneys involved in the case that under no circumstance would he be tolerating any evidence or even any discussions surrounding witchcraft, and that to him, this case revolved around nothing more than robbery, even though Nelson really did not have much wealth to his name at all. So attorneys were appointed to John and Curry, but Wilbert's family was able to afford one for their son, and the trials began on January 9th, 1929. All references of witchcraft were edited out of the confessions before they could be tabled as evidence. And because this led the case to just be really cut and dry, all three of them were found guilty of murder, with John and Curry guilty of first-degree murder and were sentenced to life in prison, and Wilbert guilty of second degree and was sentenced to 10 to 20 years. In 1934, Curry and Wilbert were paroled and went on to live respectable, quiet lives in York, while John tried for parole multiple times and was always denied. Then in 1953, after spending 23 years in prison, John Blymire was released. He returned to York as well and got a job as a janitor. He bought a nice house with the money he'd saved up while in prison and lived quietly for the rest of his life. It appeared that John never went back to doing any sort of witchcraft services because, for one, his reputation was most likely completely tarnished from murdering someone, especially someone who was also a very prominent witch in the community, but also because his actions caused this common practice of this folk magic and healing to now be considered as dangerous, and was now being considered as an impractical source of healing, and that in seeking out this type of healing, you were preventing yourself from receiving proper medical care. These days, Nelson's house still stands in the area of Hex Hollow where he used to live, and you can go and visit it, take a tour, and those who have visited the area have reported strange occurrences happening there, such as seeing a dog with red eyes in the trees, while others have claimed to see UFOs near the house. Others talk about having thrown stones at the house, just to have them hurled back toward them moments later. Some say that if you drive past the house, sometimes you can even see smoke rising up from the chimney, which some people believe is Nelson's spirit still living on his property. But that is it for today's video. I'd love to know what you guys think about it. It's definitely a very interesting case. Like I said, I was not familiar with the type of magic that Pennsylvania Dutch people use, though I'm not sure if they use it anymore. But it's definitely interesting because it involved men being at the forefront of it. But yes, if you guys are new to my channel, please give this video a like and click subscribe if you have not already. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.